Pokemon battling is pretty fucking cool. I mean, like, nothing really hits different like guessing right in the children's game. But behind every good Pokemon battle is a good team. I bet Hyper Beam kills. Hyper Beam is gonna kill, right? Bet you it kills. I'm going to fucking scream. I'm going to RBY giveth and RBY taketh away. Actually, just get paralyzed again. RBY giveth! RBY giveth! Get fucked. Get fucked. And a little bit of cheese. One of the most important aspects in team building when it comes to Pokemon is how your team is going to fare against the meta. Every single generation of Pokemon is going to have a handful of mons that you're going to be seeing time and time again, and that's typically because they're really fucking good. In Generation 4 you had Tyranitar and friends, in Generation 3 you had Tyranitar and his older friends. In Generation 2 you had Snorlax, and well, it's not really Snorlax and friends, it's more like Snorlax and the few lucky enough to be spared from his fucking wrath. I mean, honestly, he's kind of a fucking monster in Generation 2. But in Generation 1, which is my most played generation of competitive Pokemon, you've got the big three: Tauros, Snorlax, and Chansey. Now, these are all amazing Pokemon in their own right, but there's something that you might notice they all have in common. All three of them are pure normal types. In Generation 1, normal types are probably the best they've ever been. They are only resisted by Rock and can't hit Ghost type, but they've got pretty good move pools in a generation where a lot of Pokemon really don't, meaning they do have the coverage to break through these Pokemon. However, the normal type does have one weakness, and that's the fighting type. All normal types take double damage from fighting type attacks, and listen, when nearly every single team has 3 Pokemon with a shared weakness to a specific type, it's only natural to want to use that type so you can try to counter them. So, let's talk about why trying to counter the best type in the game is a pretty fucking bad idea. Before we talk about individual Pokemon, I think it kind of makes sense to just talk about the fundamental issues of the type as a whole in Generation 1. For a start, it's anything but the offensive juggernaut it is in later generations. From Generation 2 onwards, Fighting type hits 5 different types for super effective damage, but you gotta remember, 2 of those types just straight up did not exist in Generation 1. So because of that, in Generation 1, Fighting only hits Normal, Ice, and Rock for super effective damage. Hitting normal types super effectively is obviously really good, but you don't get too much mileage out of hitting Rock and Ice for super effective damage. Rhydon is far and away the best Rock type in the game, but the strongest relevant fighting attack, Machamp Submission, only has a 24.7% chance to knock it out in 2 hits. Even if you do want to fish for that chance, switching into Rhydon is really hard. It's a similar story with Ice types. Out of the 4 viable Ice types in Overused, it's kinda hard to find a solidly good matchup. Both Machamp and Hitmonlee cleanly 2-hit KO Lapras and have a chance to 2-hit KO Cloyster, but Machamp is relying on the inaccurate submission and is slower than both of them, while Hitmonlee just fucking dies if you breathe on it.